episode is simply titled Monks. Now, I usually say this at the end, but this time I'm going to say it up front. If you're a regular viewer and haven't yet, please subscribe and click the like and bell icons. That will then make sure that you get notices about when new videos drop, and likes boost the rating for CS and Into His Image here on YouTube. But of course, nothing beats it like letting others know about the channel. Now, those who missed the announcement, I've recently begun an adjunct series to Communio Sanctorum called Lessons from Church History. It's my personal take from the perspective of an evangelical pastor of 40 years on what we might have to learn from the history of the church. All right, to our subject today, monks. We took a look at the Hermits in episode 20 and delved into the beginnings of the monastic movement that swept the church. The Hermits were those who left the city to live an ultra-ascetic life of isolation, literally fleeing from the world. Others who longed for the ascetic life could not abide the isolation, and so they retreated from the world to live in sequestered communes called monasteries and nunneries. The men were called nuncs, the women, the feminine form of the same word, nonnas, or we know what as nuns. Now, in recent episodes, we've seen that the ascetic lifestyle of both hermits and monks was considered the ideal expression of devotion to God during the 4th and the 5th centuries. We're going to spend more time looking at monastery life now because it proves central to the development of the faith during the Middle Ages, and particularly in Western Europe. So let's review from episode 20, the roots of monasticism. Leisure time to converse about philosophy with friends was highly prized in the ancient world. It was fashionable for public figures to express a yearning for such intellectual leisure, or otium, as they called it. But of course, they were much too busy serving their fellow man. So it became hip to adopt the attitude, I'm so busy with my duties, I don't get much me time. Occasionally, as the famous Roman orator and senator Cicero portrayed it, they scored such time for philosophical reflection by retiring to write on themes like duty or friendship, old age. That towering intellect and theologian Augustine of Hippo had the same wish as a young man, and when he became a Christian in 386, left his professorship in oratory to devote his life to contemplation and writing. He retreated with a group of friends, his son and his mother, to a home on Lake Como to discuss and then write about the happy life, order, and other subjects in which both classical philosophy and Christianity shared a common interest. When he returned to his hometown in Tagaste in North Africa, he set up a community in which he and his friends could lead a monastic life, apart from the world, studying scripture and praying. Augustine's contemporary, Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate, he felt the same tug. He too made an attempt to live apart from the world. Now, the Christian take on this yearning for a life of philosophical retirement had an important difference from the pagan version. While reading and meditation remained central, the call to do it in concert with others who set themselves apart from the world was added. Now, for the monks and nuns who sought such a communal life, the crucial thing was the call to a way of life that would make it possible to go apart and spend time with God in prayer and worship. Prayer was the opus Dei, the work of God. As it was originally conceived, to become a monk or nun was an attempt to obey to the full the command to love God with all that one is and has. In the Middle Ages, it was also understood as a fulfillment of the command to love one's neighbor. For monks and nuns were supposed to be primarily praying for the world. They really believed that they were performing an important task on behalf of lost souls. So among the members of a monastery, there were those who prayed, those who ruled, and those who worked. The most important to society, they considered, were those who prayed. Ideally, while monks and nuns might have different duties based on their station and their assignment, they all engaged both work and prayer. But a difference developed between the monastic movements of the East and the West. In the East, the desert fathers were the ones that had set the pattern. They were hermits who adopted extreme forms of asceticism and came to be regarded as powerhouses of spiritual influence, authorities who could assist ordinary people with their problems. The Stylites, for example, lived on platforms on high poles, an object of reverence to those who came to ask their spiritual advice. Others shut themselves off from the world in caves or huts. They denied themselves contact with the temptations of the world, especially women. There was in this an obvious preoccupation with the dangers of the flesh, which was partly a legacy of the Greek dualists' conviction that matter was inherently evil. Now, I want to briefly pause the episode here to say that the fifth in the lessons from church history is going to camp on this, as it's a prime example of what we have to learn from church history here. While Eastern monks might live in a group, they didn't seek community. They didn't converse and work together in a common cause. They simply shared cells next to one another. Each followed his own schedule. Their only contact was that they ate and prayed together. This tradition continues to this day on Mount Athos in northern Greece, where monks live in solitude and prayer in cells high on the cliffs. Food is lowered to them in baskets. Monastic communities and those seeking to be monks or nuns exploded in popularity in the 4th century. This popularity was born out of a protest on the part of many at the growing secularization that they witnessed in the institutional church. We just saw how it was the moral laxity of Rome that had fired up Pelagius's indignation. The persecution that everyone was so ready to be over not long before was now looked back on almost nostalgically. Sure, the church had been hammered, but at least following Jesus meant something, and the seriousness with which people pursued spiritual things was palpable during that time. But now it seemed that every third person called themselves a Christian without much concern to be like him. So the monastic life was a way to recover what had been lost from the glory days of the persecuted but pure church. One of the first set of rules of monastic communities was developed by someone with whom we're already familiar, Basil the Great, leader of the Cappadocian Fathers, who hammered out the orthodox understanding of the Nicene Creed. Basil was born into one of the most remarkable families in Christian history. His grandmother, father, mother, sister, and 2 younger brothers were all venerated as saints. Now imagine being the black sheep in that family. All you had to do to qualify for that dubious title was to fail to make your bed. Besides taking the lead with his brother Gregory of Nyssa and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus in hammering out the exact terminology to be used in defining the orthodox position on the Trinity, Basil was an early advocate and organizer of monastic life. Taking a cue from his sister Macrina, who had founded a monastery on some of the family's property at Annecy, Basil visited the ascetics of Syria, then Palestine and Egypt, then founded his own monastery, also at Annecy, around 358. For the monks there, he drew up a rule for their lives called the asceticon, sometimes referred to as the longer and shorter rules. It consisted of 55 major regulations and 313 lesser guidelines. While each monastery during this time followed its own order, more and more began adopting Basil's template. The first rule to present a rival to Basil's was the Rule of Augustine, our friend from Hippo in North Africa. In our last few episodes on Augustine, we saw that when he returned to Tagaste, he and his friends formed a community committed to serving God. As the Bishop of Hippo, Augustine founded a monastery, turning the episcopal digs into a monastic community specifically for priests. It became a spiritual nursery that produced many of the African bishops. These priest monks were a corporate reflection of Augustine's ideal of the whole church, a witness to the future kingdom of God. The rule associated with Augustine and the monastic orders of monks, the nuns that bear his name, emphasize living in freedom under grace. They sought for their monastery to be a microcosm of the city of God, longing for mystical union with him, but firmly rooted in the love and service of others, both within their community and the wider world. Now, there's no mention of Augustine's rule in his own literary work called the Retractions, or in Posidonius's catalog, which you may remember was a list of Augustine's works. But there is evidence of a monastic rule attributed to Augustine just a century after his death. Benedict of Nursia, who we're going to get to next, knew of and was influenced by it, as were several other founders of religious orders. There are existing monastic communities today that still harken back to the Augustinian rule as the core of their order's life. A crucial development in Western monasticism took place in the 6th century, when Benedict of Nursia withdrew with a group of friends to try to live the ascetic life. This prompted him to give serious thought to the way in which religious life should be organized. Benedict arranged for groups of 12 monks to live together in small communities. Then he moved to Monte Cassino, where in 529 he set up the monastery which was to become the headquarters of the Benedictine Order. The rule of life that he drew up there was a synthesis of elements and existing rules for monastic life. From this point on, the rule of St. Benedict set the standard for living the religious life until the 12th century. Now, the rule of St. Benedict achieved a balance between body and soul. It aimed in moderation and order. It said that those who went apart from the world to live lives dedicated to God should not subject themselves to extreme asceticism. They should live in poverty and chastity and in obedience to their abbot, but they should not feel the need to brutalize their flesh with things like little scourges and hair shirts, which were common at that time. They should eat moderately, but not starve themselves. They should balance their time in a regular and orderly way between manual work, reading, and prayer, which was their real work for God. There was to be 7 regular acts of worship in the day, known as the hours, attended by the entire community. In Benedict's vision, the monastic yoke was to be sweet, the burden light. The monastery was a school of the Lord's service in which the baptized soul made progress in the Christian life. Now, a common feature of monastic life in the West was that it was largely reserved for the upper classes. The serfs didn't have the freedom to become monks. The houses of monks and nuns were the recipients of noble and royal patronage because, well, a noble assumed that by supporting such a holy endeavor, he was earning points with God. Remember as well that while the firstborn son stood to inherit everything, later sons were a potential cause of unrest if they decided to contest the elder brother's birthright. So these spare children of noble births were often given to monastic communes by their families. They were then charged with carrying the religious duty for the entire family. They were a kind of spiritual surrogate whose task was to produce a surplus of godliness that the rest of the family could draw on. Rich and powerful families gave monasteries their lands for the good of the souls of their members. Rulers and soldiers were too busy to attend to their spiritual lives as they should, and so professionals were drawn from their families to help by doing it for them. The consequence of this was that in the later Middle Ages, the head of a monastery or nunnery, called an abbot or an abbess, was usually a nobleman or woman. They were often chosen because of being the highest in birth in the monastery or convent, not usually because of any natural powers of leadership or outstanding spirituality. Chaucer's cruel 14th century caricature of an abbess depicts a woman who would have been much more at home in a country house playing with her dogs than running a nunnery. This noble patronage of monastic communities was both a source of their economic success and their eventual moral and spiritual decay. Monastic houses that became rich and were filled with those who had not chosen to enter the religious life but had been put there by their parents usually became rather decadent. The Cluniac reforms of the 10th century were a consequence of the recognition there needed to be a tightening up of things if the Benedictine order was not to be utterly lost. In the commune at Cluny and the houses which imitated it, standards were high, although here too there was a danger of distortion of the original Benedictine vision. Cluniac houses had extra rules and a degree of rigidity which compromised the original simplicity of the Benedictine plan. At the end of the 11th century, several developments radically altered the range of choice for those in the West who wanted to enter a monastery. The first was a change of fashion, which encouraged married couples of mature years to decide to end their days in monastic life. A knight who'd fought his wars might make an agreement with his wife that they would go off into separate religious houses. But these mature adults weren't the only ones entering monasteries. It became fashionable for younger people to head off to a monastery because the education there was top rank. And then monasteries began to specialize in various pursuits. It was a time of experimentation. And out of this period of experiment came an immensely important new order, the Cistercians. They used the Benedictine rule, but had a different set of priorities. The first was a determination to protect themselves from the dangers which could come from growing too rich. Now, you might ask, hold on, Lance, how could people who've taken a vow of poverty get rich? There's the rub. Yes, monks and nuns vowed poverty, But their lifestyle included diligence and work. And some brilliant minds had joined those monasteries. They devised ingenious methods for going about their work in a more productive manner, enhancing yields for crops and the invention of new products. Being deft businessmen, they worked good deals and maximized profits, which went into the monastery's account. But individual monks did not profit thereby. The funds were used to expand the monastery's resources and facilities. This led to even higher profits, which were then used in plushing up the monastery. So the cells got nicer, the food got better, the grounds more sumptuous, the library more expansive. The monks got new threads, new sandals. And outwardly, things were the same. They owned nothing personally, but in fact, their monastic world had significantly upgraded. The Cistercians responded to this by building houses in remote places and keeping them as simple, bare lodgings. They also made a place for people from the lower classes who had vocations but wanted to give themselves more completely to God. These were called lay brothers. The startling early success of the Cistercians was due to a man by the name of Bernard of Clairvaux. When he decided to enter a newly founded Cistercian monastery, he took with him a group of his friends and relatives. Because of his great oratory skill and praise for the Cistercian model, recruitment proceeded so rapidly that many more houses had to be founded in quick succession. He was made abbot of one of them at Clairvaux, from which he draws his name. He went on to become a leading figure in the monastic world and in European politics. He spoke so movingly that he was useful as a diplomatic emissary as well as a preacher. And we're going to hear more about him in a later episode. Other monastic experiments, they weren't so successful. The willingness to try new forms gave a platform for some short-lived endeavors by the eccentric. There are always those who think that their idea is the way that it ought to be. Either because they lack common sense or have no skill at recruiting others, they just fall apart. So many had been pushing on the boundaries of monastic life that in the 12th century, one writer thought that it would be helpful to review all the available modes. His work covered all the possibilities of monastic and priestly life. That same century saw the creation of new monastic orders. In Paris, the Victorines produced leading academic figures and teachers. The Premonstratensians were a group of Western monks who took on the monumental task of trying to heal the rift between the Western and Eastern churches. The problem was there was no corresponding monastic group in the East with which to negotiate. That's getting way ahead of ourselves as we try to keep close to a neat timeline. In future episodes, we'll revisit the monks and monasteries of both the Eastern and Western Church because it was often from their ranks that the movers of church history were drawn.